Hello and welcome to the second part of the American Century, as we talk about World War II. And as we talked about last time with the 1930s, Americans are hanging out, listening to the radio, and trying to recover from the Great Depression. Meanwhile, things are going very bad in Europe. There was rumbles of war. Same thing in Asia and the Pacific coast. Rumbles of war there too. And the United States tried so hard to stay out. Americans did not want to get involved in somebody else's war again. But eventually, we could not stay out. And when we pulled in, we jumped in with both feet, as you'll see. Let's go back to the 1930s. All right, so again, while people are listening to all their cool radio shows, other things are going on in other places. The League of Nations was not strong or united. If you recall, the United States refused to join. The Senate did not pass the treaty, so we didn't join. And so it really couldn't do much to stop things that were going on in Europe. By the way, you could spend an entire career studying one of the things on this checklist right in front of you in Prelude to War. World War II is probably the most studied conflict in human history. It was so big, so many things happening, so many countries involved all over the place, that researchers can just study one battle for their entire career or what happened in one country for their entire career. So this is a really short summary of the whole thing because unless you take a class on U.S. history and really focus on World War II, you won't have to learn every little detail about all this stuff until I'm saying college. Now, of course, if you're interested, there's lots of good resources, but for our purposes, we're just giving you the very basics and mainly focusing on what was, what happened in the U.S. As a result of these things. So anyway, League of Nations is not doing a great job. Germany was also in bad shape in the 1930s. The Great Depression did not just hit the U.S. It was a worldwide thing where just the economies collapsed all over the place. And Germany, it really collapsed. People were really desperate, more desperate than here. And Germans are still angry because after World War One, they had kind of started World War One and they lost World War One. So the peace treaty forced them to make their army much smaller and to give up some land and not have certain kinds of factories that could be used to make weapons. And Germany was not so happy about that. So in 1933, Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, got power in Germany and became, well, at first he was elected actually, but he gradually took power, started ignoring the constitution that had been written in the 20s, and basically took all power in the country for himself. And his idea was, we're going to rebuild Germany, we're going to take back everything everybody had taken away from us, including land, including our army, including everything. Also, they persecuted anybody who wasn't just like them. So that is why Jewish people and all kinds of minorities at first were treated badly, and then were treated worse, and then were forced to go into prisons, and eventually were killed in the Holocaust. It was horrible. We'll learn about that next year in eighth grade. That's part of the eighth grade curriculum. It was bad. Adolf Hitler was a bad person. I don't like to judge people. I can judge him. He was awful. But at first, people in Germany thought he's going to rebuild the country, so that's good. In Italy, a very similar kind of guy, Benito Mussolini, who has a nice name but also not a nice guy, also took power. And him and Hitler were kind of buddies, and they formed an alliance in the mid 30s. Actually, the picture in the background, that's Mussolini on the left, Hitler in the middle, and then the third person, Prime Minister Tojo, on the right. He was the Prime Minister of Japan starting in the late 1930s, and he also wanted his country to be very powerful too. And so, even though they don't have a whole lot in common with Germany or Italy, they signed an agreement saying they didn't really help each other so much fighting, but they agreed to support each other, to share some intelligence, and to stay out of each other's way. And they became known as the Axis powers. And then they started to attack people. And again, you don't have to memorize all these dates and years and stuff, but just get the idea of what really started happening in the late 30s. At first, Germany just broke the peace treaty that they weren't supposed to have certain kind of weapons or certain kind of factories, and Hitler was like, "Well, we're not following that anymore," and they started to rebuild their army. About the same year, Italy invaded Ethiopia. It's a long story why they invaded in Africa, but they did, and they took over Ethiopia. Then in 1937, as you see, Japan they invaded China and Mongolia and took over big chunks of those countries. In 1938, Hitler kind of threatened Austria, not Australia, Austria, next door to Germany, and kind of took over the country without firing a shot, and also took over parts of Czechoslovakia. Some of that land had been German until World War One, and so they took it back. And while other countries in Europe kind of sat back and looked like, oh, this could get bad, but they didn't want to start a fight. But then they couldn't stop starting a fight because two things happened. One, Germany shocked the world. Them and the Soviet Union were not very friendly, but they signed a peace treaty in 1939 saying they will not attack each other. And so now, knowing that Soviet Union was not going to attack them, Germany started invading everybody. They took over Poland in 1939, rolled in and took over the country in just a few weeks. In 1940, they rolled the other way. You can look at the map there, and went into Belgium, went into Denmark, went into France. France was supposed to be a big, strong country. They, in weeks, half the country had been taken over, including Paris, and they surrendered. And by the middle of 1940, as you see on that map, Germany had taken over. I mean, I didn't even mention all the countries. They had taken over almost all of Europe. The last country still standing was Great Britain, aka England. The island nation there was alone, basically, to stand against Germany. If you look at that map, the countries that are in that tannish color are all neutral. Spain, actually, their leader, Francisco Franco, was another big friend of Hitler's. So even though they didn't really fight in the war too much, Spain was a friend of Hitler. So they basically took over every country that wasn't their buddy in Europe except for Great Britain. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan started doing the same thing. They had already taken over chunks of China. They took more. And then, as you see in the map, they invaded what is now Vietnam and that area down there and started invading different islands here and there, looking for more resources because Japan does not have a lot of resources, oil and rubber and things like that, that is needed to, get an army going. So they were invading places that had those resources to get their army going more. And then in 1941, Germany broke their treaty with the Soviet Union and invaded them. And they were rolling through the country just like they had rolled through France and Poland and had gone hundreds of miles in just a few weeks, pushing back the Soviet army, which was supposed to be very powerful, until they were almost there. There are, I see, nobody took a picture, but there are reports that the Germans could see the top of the spires there in St. Peter's Basilica there, the famous onion squares there in Moscow, Russia. From where they were, they got that close to Moscow. Things look really bad. But Americans did not want to get involved. If you can see the two things in the background on the left, that's an actual button from the 40s saying, keep us out of war. That's what some people wanted to do. On the right side, that cartoon, there's Uncle Sam standing there right about on Tallahassee, actually, looking over towards Europe that's in flames, saying, well, that ain't what it used to be. But are we going to do anything about it? Let's put our hands in our pockets and just be, isn't that terrible? So Americans really sympathized with the British. They thought what Germany was doing was terrible. There are not too many Americans who were fans of Hitler, but that we want to start sending people over there, sending troops over there to get killed, we didn't want to go that far. So we didn't. President Roosevelt, though, was he was working with Winston Churchill, the leader of England, and we sent them a lot of equipment, ships, planes, all kinds of stuff. Not for free. We said, "Oh, pay us when you can." But basically, we were giving it to them to help fight against Germany, and so they were able to fight off Germany. They had been bombed relentlessly in 1940, 1941. England was just bombed every day, every night, with German planes flying in over from France. So they had taken over France, and bombing England. And the English Air Force was trying to fight them off. And so cities were blown up, and well, not whole cities, but there was bombs falling in London and everywhere else. But the English were able to fight them off. It took months of bombing, but eventually the German leaders realized they're losing so many planes that they're going to lose their whole air force trying to bomb England. So they stopped the attacks and gave up trying to invade England. So that was the first time really that Germany had been stopped, because until then they were just rolling over everybody. And England was able to stop them, at least slow them down, because we helped them with equipment. But still, Americans did not want to get involved in a foreign war until something terrible happened in Hawaii. Yes, beautiful Hawaii. It was a U.S. territory at the time, and right there was the largest naval base in the world at the time, at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, right outside of Honolulu. And we had stationed there the Pacific Fleet, the most powerful fleet in the world at the time. And Japan figured that at some time we're going to try to stop them. So on December 7th, they came in and attacked that naval base. Their plan was take out the Pacific Fleet. and weaken United States strength in the Pacific Ocean area so much that we could not stop what they were doing, taking over other islands, taking over the Philippines, and really digging in so much that it would be almost impossible for Americans to get them out. So the sneak attack was supposed to just wipe out everything that we had on that side of the world. Now, the attack happened early in the morning. And so in the rest of the country, it was Sunday afternoon, a relaxing Sunday. People were sitting back listening to, your radio shows, eating big Sunday dinners, or maybe listening to the NFL playoffs, which was going on at the time when everything changed.
Heinrich calls the signals. Waitaka over the ball at center. Heinrich takes. He's going back to throw in the first play. He throws, and it's broken up by whom? Gino Marchetti, the big defensive left end. Jumped high in the air to...
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Stay tuned to WOR for...
1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 moment, please. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hello, NBC. Hello, NBC. This is KTU in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning a distant view, a brief battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese. The city of Honolulu has also been attacked and considerable damage done. This battle has been going on for nearly 3 hours. One of the bombs dropped within 50 feet of KTU Tower. It is no joke, it is a real war. Public of Honolulu has been advised to keep in their homes and await results from the Army and Navy. There has been fierce fighting going on in the air and on the sea. The heavy shooting seems to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Just a moment, we'll interrupt you. We cannot estimate yet how much damage has been done, but it has been a very severe attack. The Navy and Army appear now to have the air and the sea under control. Just a minute, we only have just a second, please. This is the telephone company, the chief operator. Yes. We tried to get through on an emergency call. Could you tell me? Well, we're talking to New York now. Please, sir. 1, 2. 1 moment, please.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu. We take you now to Washington.
The details are not available. They will be in a few minutes. The White House is now giving out a statement. The attack apparently was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu. The President's brief statement was read to reporters by Stephen Early, the President's secretary. And just now comes the word from the President's office that a second air attack has been reported on Army and Navy bases in Manila. Thus, we have official announcements from the White House that Japanese airplanes have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and have now attacked Army and Navy bases in Manila. Such an attack would naturally bring a counterattack, and hostilities of this kind would naturally mean that the President would ask Congress for a declaration of war. There is no doubt from the temper of Congress that such a declaration would be granted.
Senators,
and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States.
Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
And the Japanese plan almost worked. The flaw was that our aircraft carriers were not in base. They were out on a practice mission when the attack happened. So they survived. And the United States was able to use those aircraft carriers to actually change how naval warfare was fought and fought back against Japan relatively quickly. So the plan devastated our fleet but did not destroy it. And that was enough to eventually claw back into it. So like it or not, we were pulled into the war. So these are posters, by the way, propaganda posters that were kind of common during the war, because it really was everybody's job, as Uncle Sam there putting on his work hat on the left was saying, because millions of young men went off to fight in the wars. We were fighting two wars, one against Japan in the Pacific, but then also as soon as we declared war on Japan, then Germany was their ally. They declared war on us, so we went and started helping England fighting against Germany in Europe. So we're fighting two wars at the same time. So millions of young men were off fighting in the war, and that meant that a lot of people had to go work in other things, like that famous "We Can Do It" poster there with Rosie the Riveter. That that was women had to go into the factories. Somebody had to build these planes and tanks and everything else, and do all the other jobs that men had been doing. So women had to go do that stuff, and they did a good job. And we can do it, said the poster. The war bonds. War bonds is basically you use some of your paycheck and you buy a bond from the government, and you're loaning money to the government to help fight the war. And then after the war, they paid you back with interest. So it wasn't a huge sacrifice, really. You gave up money now, but you got more money back later. And during the war, there really wasn't much to buy. A lot of factories stopped making stuff for people to buy in stores and started making things like planes and tanks and parts for planes and tanks and ships. So there wasn't much to buy anyway. So you just loan some money to the government and you get paid back later. That united our strong poster up there. You notice all the flags because we were in it together with a lot of countries in there. And there's some smaller countries in there too, Norway and stuff. But the big three were Great Britain, United States, and the Soviet Union, who, again, us and the Soviet Union didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of things, but we agreed that we all hated Hitler, so we were going to go get him together. And that last one, that keep calm and carry on, yes, that's a meme, but you know what? It started during World War II. Those are posters. You see the crown. Those are posters that were hung up all over London when they were being bombed by the Germans in 1940, 41, and then later in the war, Germans invented rocket weapons. The first rockets that went into space were German weapons that were fired from France and landed on England, and you couldn't really stop it because they went really high and just kind of dropped. But you know, you got to keep going. You went about your daily life, so that keep calm and carry on became the cry in England, because you know, the stiff upper lip. We're English and we'll get through this. That was a terrible accent, and I apologize. But those are all posters. We're not going to go through every battle and such right now. Again, you can study so much about World War II. So much material out there, and there's tons of stuff in the classroom that I'm sorry you can't see right now. But maybe next year, stop by and borrow some of the books. But I will tell you how the war ended. So in Europe, D-Day was a big deal. June 6, 1944, the United States and England, with some help from Canadian troops and some French troops that had escaped France and still wanted to fight, we all landed on the northern coast of France, a place called Normandy, trying to shove the Germans out. The landing was horrific. Germans knew they were coming. We kind of faked them out that we're going to land somewhere else, but still, they had a lot of defenses, and landing on that beach was deadly. I don't think that Saving Private Ryan perhaps is an appropriate movie for most young people to see, but the opening scene shows D-Day, and the director wanted to make it as accurate as possible and talk with people that actually were there, and it is intense, horrific stuff, because that's how the landing was, intense and horrific. But the forces land on the beach, were able to shove the Germans back a bit, land more supplies, and that was the beginning of the end of the war. Because slowly, American and British forces pushed through France and then started pushing back into Germany over months, shoving the Germans back out. On the other side, this was a huge help. The Soviet Union was also attacking Germany from the east side, pushing back out of the Soviet Union, shoving the Germans out of their country, and then shoving them back across Poland, and then shoving them back into Germany. And so the Germans were fighting, you know, against three countries at once, and though they had the powerful army, they were fighting against three countries at once, and they slowly got squished. And eventually, in May 1945, the armies pretty much met. The Americans and British were in one side of Germany, coming on the capital of Berlin, and the Soviets were on the other side. The Soviets got there a little bit first. Either way, Hitler died under mysterious circumstances, and Germany surrendered. And that's called VE Day, Victory in Europe. Meanwhile, on the other side, the United States was basically fighting by ourselves. We kept trying to get the Soviet Union to help us fight Japan, but they were reluctant because they wanted to concentrate on Germany. The Soviet Union is so big, and Russia is still so big, that, you know, it goes all the way from Europe all the way to Asia, and it's pretty close to Japan on the Pacific side. But they were busy fighting the Germans. So we were fighting Japan pretty much by ourselves, and we tried the island hopping strategy, which means we just hopped along on different islands, took really important islands, getting ever closer to Japan so we could build more airstrips to get more airplanes and troops closer and closer. Eventually, we had done that and taken back most of the land they had taken over, but they still refused to surrender. So this is a really tough choice that President Truman had. President Roosevelt died in April 1945, so he did not see the end of the war, which is so sad because he led the country through the whole thing. But he was kind of old, not in great shape, and he died. So his vice president Harry Truman stepped up and like, all right, here you go, Mr. President. Now you got this big important call to make. And so his two choices were invade Japan, and a lot of people would have been killed. Both sides and cities devastated. Or we had this new experimental top secret weapon, the atomic bomb, and we could drop that on Japan and see if that would force them to surrender. And he chose choice number two. So we dropped the bomb on two cities in Japan in August 1945 with devastating effect. And they really couldn't stop us at the time, so we could have kept dropping bombs, and they finally just surrendered. So on August 15th, 1945, World War II was finally over. And by the way, that's called VJ Day, Victory over Japan. So, next we could go into the real aftermath, but right after the war, Europe was a complete disaster, and so was Japan. Just devastated. It took many years, took decades for some places to recover. There was still rubble on the streets of London, even into the 1950s, because there was so much had been destroyed. So yeah, it was really tough for people in Europe. The Soviet Union had also been beat up pretty bad, but at the end of the war, they still had the most powerful army in Europe, and they had troops all over the place in Eastern Europe where they had shoved the Germans out, and they didn't want to leave. But that we'll talk more about that next week. The U.S., on the other hand, yes, we had lost a lot of soldiers, but there had been no fighting in the U.S. Pearl Harbor was in Hawaii, but that was pretty much it. No other fighting on U.S. soil, so all our cities are fine, all our factories are fine. Nobody got all their homes blown up and everything. So the United States was like set up, man. We were the most powerful country in the world, and everybody wanted to buy some stuff. They needed equipment, they needed more washing machines, they needed trucks and planes or whatever, construction equipment to rebuild their countries. Well, then here you go. American factories are ready to go for you. So by the end of the war, we were really set up to become the most powerful country in the world, and we were. But the Soviet Union had something to say about that. But that's for next week. So thanks for listening.